Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Township of Georgian Bay Committee of the Whole meeting for February 4th, 2025. I'd like to call this meeting to order at 11:35. I'm going to forego the land acknowledgement because we've already done that this morning. And I could ask council if there's any pecuniary interest or conflict of interest, but obviously we all have a pecuniary interest in the topic at hand, which is council remuneration. So I'm not sure how we handle that other than we're allowed to consider this an exception. And with that, let's go to a staff report on council remuneration options. And Ms. Way, you're going to tell us what we should be considering today, or what you would like us to consider today.
Thank you, Your Worship. In 2024, staff were asked to review mileage and travel expenses of council. So this report is being brought forward for that. However, it's not a cut and dry process to be able to just, the way our system is set up or our council remuneration is set up to say, you know, you currently make 50 cents in mileage and here are your options to make 55, 60 and what the financial impact may be. Same as with the travel expense. So currently, council, if you're attending conference or training that's outside of a council meeting, you're paid mileage per our township's travel and expense policy, same to that of the staff members as well. As for your attendance to and from meetings, you have a meeting allowance that's allocated for each year and paid out monthly in addition to your council remuneration. You also have an IT stipend that's paid out annually, and then the 4 ward councillors also have an additional IT stipend that they make at the beginning of each term. The mayor and district councillors receive an IT stipend if some construct from the district, so that's why there's those 3 positions do not receive one. In my report, I outline the total remuneration that our council is receiving, as well as a comparison to the remuneration received across the district of Muskoka. Again, it's kind of like comparing apples and oranges. Some people don't have benefits. Some people get cash in lieu of benefits. Some places get mileage versus meeting allowance. Because it's not quite a cut and dry process, and we don't currently have mileage to and from meetings, we have the meeting allowance. I wasn't sure what the approach was or what the intention was of council, so I'm presenting you with the general information of where we're at. And then I have a breakdown of 6 options that I would like further direction on and where you would like me to go with this, or if anything at all. So option 1 is remain status quo. Option 2 is just to review the travel and expense policy as it would apply to council and staff. Option 3 would be to provide options for travel allowance and or mileage options, which may include the removal of the meeting allowance. Alternatively, the meeting allowance could just be rolled into the remuneration. Option 4 would be to provide options for an annual honorarium. Option 5 would include options for an IT stipend, and option 6 would be to conduct a full review and provide options for travel allowance and or mileage, annual honorarium, and the IT stipend.
Honorarium versus salary versus pay? I guess it all depends on how you look at it.
So technically your honorarium is your pay.
Okay. All right. Councillor Wojcik, I see your hand first, followed by Councillor Cooper.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor, just some clarification from our clerk. I believe I heard you say review of travel expenses for council and staff. Could you clarify that for me?
Certainly. The policy that's in place right now, which is the travel and expense policy, is cut for staff and council. We have one policy that encompasses everybody.
So if council were to vote a travel expense increase, staff would get the same?
Potentially, I would provide the options for what that would be, but reviewing that policy would involve a review for everybody. The end result might be different. It might be including 2 policies or something different at the end of the day. But currently it's one policy, so if I open it up for one, I'm opening up that can of worms for both.
Okay, so if I could get further clarification, if a staff member is traveling to work from Innisfil, would they be paid okay?
No, that's only for training conferences offsite, not our daily commute to and from the office.
Thank you.
Councillor Cooper.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you, Clerk Way. I just would like to make an observation. We've been talking in a recent subject matter about what the future might look like in terms of being able to consider planning matters. The same would apply to making sure that we can attract councillors in the future. And that is of a concern. We may have a little, or maybe more than we think, turnover at the end of this session. And with that in mind, at the moment we have 6 out of the 7 councillors are from outside of the municipality some months of the year, depending on you know, your access to a property here, etc. But regardless, I think it would be incumbent upon us to give some thought to this. I do realize that it's somewhat of a giving back to the community, volunteer kind of role. That certainly the compensation relative to the time is not necessarily aligned by any means, but I don't think councillors should be out of pocket myself. If we're, you know, being fair about it, especially given the remuneration is somewhat limited. So, you know, maybe some people spend less time. I don't think too many of us here sitting at the table would say that it's a 5 or 10 hour a week job. It's almost like a full-time job. And so all I'm cautioning us, thinking of the future, we want to be able to attract representatives, and yes, we want representatives from our permanent resident community. That's certainly very important, but recognizing that 83–85% of our population is seasonal. Many of them would be commuting from over many kilometers outside of this township, given the border. And where we come to here for our meetings, we're right on the border. So we need to remember that many would be traveling a long distance just to get to here on the inside of the township border, so to speak. So I'm suggesting that I sort of skimmed through this, but I don't think there's anything here that's sort of dealing with what I've just raised, is there?
I think what you're referring to would be option 6, which is a full review of the honorarium, the meeting allowance, and the IT stipend.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
It would be a full review of all of the options, so the honorarium, the meeting allowance, and the IT stipend, which is option 6 listed.
Okay, so it's a review, but I'm giving you my review of it in terms of the travel expense side of things more than anything else. I'm not too concerned particularly about the honorarium per se, because you know, I frankly don't necessarily look at some of the other places in the district of Muskoka. We also need to think about like townships, the archipelago, but I could think of others where there's sort of a seasonal resident community like Collingwood and places like that. So those could be other comparators, just as a suggestion, but also give some thought about mileage allowances outside of the township, if you know what I mean by that.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Graziano.
Thank you, Worship. I would echo Councillor Cooper, but add some additional comments to that. I believe that option 6 is likely the more prudent approach here. We've experienced very inflationary times. There have been the addition of new taxes that have been imposed on us by upper tier governments, and everything is just costing more. With that said, from a recruitment standpoint, you know, it will start to impact our municipality's ability to attract new candidates who wish or seek to run. And it shouldn't be expected that they're a charity. I mean, we've come to learn that we are exposed in litigation matters at times, and we can be exposed. We've come to learn that, you know, we are paying a substantial or exorbitant amount of money to sustain our civic obligations. And I'll use an example. When I fill up my boat, I'm paying $2 to $2.20 a liter at the marina, where all I'm getting, and I'm not even eligible for kilometers on my boating traffic or my boating, and so this is where I think staff, it would be incumbent on staff to start to consider policies that are applicable to our municipality, that are applicable to the times, that address the changes that we've seen. And I would endeavor to go on to say that it's likely best that we separate out our policy and break it into two and tee it off to have one that's specific to staff and one that's specific to council. And the reason for my argument is that staff have embedded within their job descriptions other responsibilities that may include their requirement to drive. And so as part of their employment agreement, the understanding that, their ability to drive to and from is going to be a requirement of their job, where with us, it's really us having to service our constituency, and we're doing so at a disadvantage. So my recommendation is option 6, and we fork it into 2, which is staff and council only. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and through you, Your Worship. I know we have 6 options in front of us, but I think really if we're looking at I think it's really more binary. We're either looking at this or we're not looking at this. So because we can't look at the honorarium in isolation, because it has an impact on the overall package that is looked at by a particular candidate, I would say. My view on the honorarium, it's complicated, just like I think everybody else. You can't put an hourly wage towards what it is we do. We probably make 50 cents an hour if you work it out. So how do we make that minimum wage and still make it affordable for the township to manage the honorarium towards us and make it kind of fair across the other areas? So do we just leave it then the way it is, or because you can't address it fully? But I guess a review of some sort would be beneficial. And then in terms of timing, I guess my question is, would it be more prudent to put in a new policy before a new council or after a new council? Are we hand tying them, or are we giving them an opportunity to kind of define and pass their honorarium themselves? So is that more or less serving? And I'm not sure if staff has thoughts on that. And my only other question to raise is, has staff raised issues with the travel and expense policy that would merit opening it up, or is that just part of this review option?
I'll let CEO Mariotti correct me if I'm wrong, but I have not heard any comments about staff having concerns with our travel and expense policy and the mileage paid out. I'm not, yeah, from a staff perspective, no one's complained or provided comments.
If I may, and I'm looking at Ms. Rattigan, because I believe the mileage component is CRA set anyway. So really, whether it's mileage for council or mileage for staff, then staff would only claim mileage were they A, if they cannot use a company vehicle, and B, if they have to use their own personal vehicle, that's only for training. It's not going back and forth from the house. But the mileage rate itself is set per the CRA rate.
So then maybe what I would suggest is another option 7, which is conduct a review of everything except for the travel and expense policy. If it's not broken, I think if there's issues relating to council, that could be crafted in part of the honorarium compensation policy that we have for council. But I would recommend not opening up travel and expense if it's not broken. That's my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hazelton.
So bridging from some of the comments you already heard, I think we want to look at this with a couple of different objectives. The first objective, I think, is we need to be able to attract new councillor candidates going forward. And my fear is that we've gone through a term. I think in the previous term, we voted not to even do a cost of living increase. I would say that the compensation for the work that is done is not commensurate with the effort put forth by any of us. But I think, you know, I don't want to be perceived as whining. I want us to focus on how do we attract new councillor candidates with remuneration as a key component of it. And what we've just learned, and you've heard other councillors refer, we're at risk just sitting in these chairs, it appears. And I think that's obscene, but I think we need to understand that and address it. The second thing that I think we need to focus on from an objective standpoint is we need to cover the expenses to meet the expectations of the policy that we put in place, where we expect 50% in-person attendance. And, you know, when we look at the compensation and the mileage and the meeting allowances and so on, those for the District of Muskoka, for example, are all based on people that live in the community and have a short commute, and that's fine. Our current structure of our council reflects our resident mix of you know, water access, seasonal, etc. We are a unique township, and you know, I've already heard, for example, that for the district there is an opportunity to, and you've included it here, the variables. You have auto mileage, you have boat mileage. You know, I think that you know, in the winter time, sorry, in the non-soft water time, people will typically be driving in a car. But in the soft water time, they'll be coming in via a marine vessel. And I think that needs to be reflected. And again, we're a unique township. Nobody in Canada has the percentage of seasonal residents that we have. And what's I think also important is, you know, yes, we're talking about council remuneration predominantly focused on meetings, but let's also understand that all of the water access properties are attended to by water access councillors, none of which we ever have an opportunity to expense in costs. So the costs of being a water access only councillor are way out of line, or out of way over the top of any drive to like councillor in any township, municipality anywhere in Canada. And I think we need to be reflective of that. So from my perspective, you know, yes, we do need to do a comprehensive look at things. I don't really think that, well, perhaps the overall compensation is something to consider. But at the end of the day, I wouldn't want any councillor to feel like they're spending out-of-pocket money to come to these meetings. And as I said, the current package is predicated on councillors who live in the community of the council chambers, and that does not apply to our township. So I think covering expenses to get to and from this job should be something that we step up to and embrace, and we deal with the mix of car-based and marine-based. Thank you.
I think I have quite a different perspective. And one, I always prefer things that are simple versus complicated. I also recognize that when you're talking about the mileage rate, you know, and you said the CRA sets the rate. No, they don't. They set the maximum. Now, many people expect to be paid the maximum, but in the private industry, they often are not. So that's one comment. The second comment is, you know, from a CRA perspective, going to and from your job for most employees is on you, not on your employer. That you cannot deduct that as an expense, the commute back and forth from your residence to your place of work. I've talked to numerous people over the years inquiring about what it takes to be a counselor, what you know, hours and responsibilities and things like that. And some of them ask about how much the job pays. But to the best of my knowledge, none of them are making their decision based on pay. Some of them are basing it on hours. Like for instance, when they discover that we meet during the day versus the evening, they know it's not compatible with having a regular job in the, I'll call it the normal daytime hours, unless they have flexibility. And sometimes when they own their own business, they can have that flexibility. I mean, and I think we have to break this down, in my opinion, into, I know there's 6 options in front of us, but as far as I'm concerned, there's 2 topics to discuss. One is, what should the pay rate be for being a counselor? And 2, what expenses should be reimbursed or not reimbursed? And, you know, we know when I mean, it's interesting because Clerk White provided a comparison here and went and basically counselors in the balance of the township, in the balance of the district, are all being paid roughly in the mid-20s. But that doesn't include the meeting allowance. And in my opinion, having an honorarium plus a meeting allowance is ridiculous, because from a CRA point of view, it's taxable income, full stop. I think part of what happened here is prior to 2018, the way and 2 of our counselors would know it if they remember, what you were paid were two components. One was, I'm going to call it a salary or an honorarium, and the second was an expense allowance that was allowed to be up to 50% of your honorarium. So if your honorarium was $10,000, you got $5,000 up to $5,000 travel expense, which was not taxable. So then what happened for 2018, I think, or 29, I've forgotten the year, but anyway, when we started the prior term, not this term, the prior term, the end of the 2014-2018 term, councils all over the country went through this exercise. Okay, what are we doing now? Because the tax system is changing. And in most cases, what they did is they gave themselves a raise to recognize the fact that tax-free expense is now attracting taxes. So they basically tried to figure out the right rate. So if you're receiving $15,000 before and $10,000 was taxable, you are now receiving, for argument's sake, $17,500 in total, because you had to pay tax on the whole. And people went through all sorts of exercises. But that was a significant change in how we looked at the CRA made a significant change in how we looked at our remuneration, in that they, in the past, said municipal councillors should get a tax-free expense allowance to reflect the fact that they faced all sorts of expenses doing their job. So in my mind, I don't see any point in having 2 lines on our pay stub, if you will, one that says honorarium and the other one says meeting allowance, because the meeting allowance, we're paid the same thing whether we show up or not, whether we are in person or online, whether we're on 1 committee or 1,000 committees. It's, you know, it doesn't change. So that's one thing. I have some difficulty with paying us, let's call it mileage, getting from our home to Port Severn for meetings. And the reason and I heard at least one of you say that, well, maybe the mileage outside the township. So my question then, if we take that approach, I mean, I'm in Barrie in the winter, but if I lived in Mactier, my commute to the office here would be almost the same in time and distance. And so then my question is, well, are we going to pay me if I'm in Barrie, but not pay me meeting mileage if I'm in Mactier? So, are we going to adjust pay because half of the year I have a 15-minute drive and half the year I have a 35-minute drive? To me, we're going to make this complicated, and are we going to go to the basis? And we know that the district, for instance, does this. They keep track of whether you're attending in person versus online, because they pay mileage to get to the meeting, but they don't pay it if you're online, to the best of my knowledge. So because they kind of keep track of that. Nor do they pay it if you are attending meetings where you're not actually a member of the committee. It's going to get complicated, and I'm not sure that I buy into the argument that people aren't going to run for council if they're not going to get compensated for the cost of getting to and from the meeting. I think it'd be far simpler for us to say right now our honorarium and our meeting allowance is roughly 30 grand. I'm rounding, but it's roughly 30 grand for a council position. And maybe we should be talking about, we should make that 35. I'm just throwing a number out there. And in other words, we're going to pay a little bit more than what many of our neighbors are paying for their positions, but we are going to do that because we recognize that many of our residents will have a longer or more expensive commute than they would in other communities or other municipalities. By the way, we are not the only community where we have a majority of our residents are seasonal. I think of the archipelago, for instance. There's a couple of communities that are near Algonquin Park, and I forgot which ones are which, that have the same ratios. I think there's at least one on Lake Erie that has a similar sort of ratio. So there are at least a handful of other communities that are similar to us, and that they have more seasonal residents than permanent residents. And I'm not sure what each of them do with regards to commuting costs versus salary. But anyway, that's my take. I already see different hands coming up for the second round, so we'll get into the second round. But I have a strong preference for simplicity. And the more complicated we make it, the more we're going to ask staff to be tracking us and then discovering, oh, so-and-so said they were going to be in person, but they showed up online, or vice versa, and then have to keep all that stuff. I mean, it can be done. But I also think, final thought here is, for this round, what do our residents think? The people who are paying us. Are we worth the money they're paying us? Are they willing to pay us more and do they believe that if they pay us more, they're going to get a higher quality candidate to vote for? I don't know, but that, to me, it'd be wonderful if we were to get the reaction of some of our residents as to, who, by the way, some on a very regular basis say we spend too much money, and sometimes they think that we spend too much money on ourselves. So I just put that out there as I think we have to consider that as part of our overall deliberations. My thoughts, and now we're going to start the next round. And Councillor Bochek, you've had your hand up for a while.
Yes, thank you through the mayor. And just for clarity purposes, in previous terms of council, 30% of our wage was tax-free, and that's the way it was done. And when the government took that 30% away, we gave ourselves a raise to compensate for that amount. And since we're in the committee of the whole and things are a little looser than when we're at council, I thought I'd say that councillors that serve three terms should have a retroactive pension, which would solve a lot of the problem, right, Peter? Absolutely. Okay, so we're good on that one. Yeah, exactly. A raise in health benefits would certainly go a long ways, because we're given a snippet, or whatever you call it, of $3,000 per year. That's a dentist appointment and a half with the inflationary rates of what's been going on. So I would consider looking at a review of our benefits package and see if we can't make that more suitable to the day. I sympathize the councillors that come from out of the township. I probably spend about $4 in fuel per year getting back and forth to the council's chambers, but others don't. However, being the only councillor that lives within the township, my expenses visiting constituents is far more than others, because most constituents know that their councillors are out of the town. So I go down to Honey Harbor to visit people. I go up to Mactier to meetings about firearms. There's a lot of travel even for a local councillor. So I do a lot more than just drive to this office. And lastly, I think Councillor Graziano will agree with me, and I'll make a point in case where if we get a call within Ward 3 that says, I live on the Severn River above the Big Chute adjacent to Muskoka Lakes property. I get in my boat here, go pay for the Big Chute to go up top, go to the constituent's house, back down the Big Chute and back to my house, where Councillor Graziano has to put his boat on a trailer, drag it up, launch it, and then go up to the constituent's office or home. So there's a lot more expenses that councillors incur than just driving back and forth to the office. I don't know what the answer is. It could just be like our mayor said, just increase, without having all these different categories, which I've explained here, just increase the honorarium, understanding what the expenses that councillors are going through. So number 6 would be a good option. So we could have a fulsome review. But I think personally, the councillors barely break even. I know I do, because I'm still a working councillor. So this money we get here is taxable based on my full income, which I'm sure other councillors have investments that give them taxable income. So the tax I pay here is very small, but on 100,000 or 150,000 puts you into a different tax bracket, and this is included in that taxable amount. And all of a sudden, 45% of this is going to taxes, or 40% is going to taxes. So I'm in agreement. We need to figure out an amount for an honorarium that's going to cover our expenses and attract new people to the council table, because I've heard repeatedly, are you kidding me? You think I'm going to go through that for $5 an hour, $1 an hour? So 2 points I have to make. One, I believe the honorarium should go up to cover our costs. And I still think a third-year term councillor should get a good pension. Laughingly.
So, and we're going to go to the next third term councillor, and that'd be Councillor Cooper.
Thank you for that. I just wanted to clarify a couple of things. One is the expenses that, in terms of travel, Councillor Bochek was referring to the costs of, often most of what you talked about was driving to Mactier or driving somewhere in a car. But a boat's a different, a vessel's a different kettle of fish. The District of Muskoka, in their wisdom, when I raised this issue with them, phoned around Canada and found municipalities in the Gulf Islands and British Columbia, where the councillors almost all traveled by water, and came up with this 6 times whatever is paid now for a boat. And I can say, well, gee, that sounds like a lot. Well, if you actually drive a boat like I do, which is 24 feet long and pushes a lot of water, I can tell you, I can give you an example. I don't very often examine it this way, but I I took one of our staff members around to introduce them to the Georgian Bay, so to speak. They were new. And I believe the travel for me that day, just for gas, was $150. I gassed up before when I got there, and afterwards I totaled it $150 just for the gas. That doesn't wear and tear, amortization, all of that would be on top of that. So you might be talking about $200 or $250. And that's a lot when you do that, remembering that your water access counselors are always out on the bay and traveling to meetings and over great distances. So we're talking thousands and thousands of dollars for travel expense. So I think I wanted to make that point, but there's a few other points I'd like to make. One being is that while we were looking here, for example, at the population, 85% of our population is seasonal, and we have a similar representation here at council. It's almost identical in terms of percentage, but we've got a number here that says 3,400. I'm sorry, it's 20,000, and we have a second home study that adds 16,500 to 3,500. So that isn't in this piece here, and I think it's important to remember that that is who we represent. That's who our customer is. That's who pays the taxes. And so I think we need to remember that. I have a few other comments. As far as, sort of saying, are we employees or like employees? And I say we're not. We're certainly not paid like employees. And most of our senior management team make significantly different amounts of money than we do as councillors. And I'm not suggesting that we should be making the money that they make. I'm just pointing out that we're not paid like employees, and nor in the amount. So that I wanted to sort of comment on. I do believe that, as I said at the outset, that it's pretty critical for us to consider what this could look like if we can't attract people. And I agree with Councillor Bocek. I've had a lot of people ask me about this, and I didn't get a reaction from people that said, I wouldn't do it for that money, but why would you, sort of thing. I don't need it, but why would I put myself through that? And even if there was a lot more money in the game, including especially travel expense, I'm not convinced it's going to be very easy to attract people. And that's why I'm pretty hot on this subject of making sure that at the very least we look after our counselors from out-of-pocket expense. And and if we raise the what do we call it, honorarium, I think there's a concern there for me in terms of a bit of a red flag, because it's sort of signaling, well, we're going to look after ourselves. We're going to give ourselves a great big raise. I think cover us off for where we're out of pocket and pay us our honorarium and the rest of the time that we put in that's way over that amount of money is a volunteer contribution. And that's the way I look at this work. I consider it a volunteer job with a little bit of pocket money. So I just wanted to remind us all of that. And I really do think when we look at Township of Georgian Bay, yes, there are other places that have seasonal populations, but their seasonal populations are not necessarily water access populations. And 50% of our population is water access, and that's expensive and time consuming. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Graziano.
Sorry, Worship, just technical difficulties. Couple of comments then, if I may, for a moment. If we were to look left and right and here at home, we would notice something consistent, and that is that the majority of council is what I'm going to assume comprised of mainly or predominantly retirees. And the reason why I'm making note of this is because ultimately, when we talk about recruitment, we talk about replacing, or our successors in the future. I'm going to borrow a American Revolution slogan, which is taxation without representation. Now, I'm the youngest baby of the group here, and my contributions, my civic obligations, come at a very heavy cost. That is, by way of opportunity cost, I would likely stand to make far more money focusing on developing and scaling my business, and allocating my time towards my family, than in joining us all here today. But I do so because I rose to the occasion, and I wanted to serve my community, and I wanted to make our community a better place. I fear that if we don't get current with the times, and with the costs associated with the obligations that we have subscribed to, that we will preclude people of my age, and maintain a group that is representative of what we see here today. And there's nothing wrong with that. Some gray hairs are fantastic. Some no hairs equally fantastic. And of course, Councillor Predko looks like he's in his 30s. So, but joking aside, there is that. We have to acknowledge the fact that everything's costing us more. Now, I spoke yesterday in council about common sense. And I question whether or not we need to codify a policy that outlines every consideration. Councillor Bocek hit the nail on the head, specifically with the nuanced requirements within my ward. And Councillor Bocek cited this because, of course, he had experienced this himself. To his point, I get a phone call on the river. I am having to get my boat, drive it down, get it into, I'm paying launch fees, I'm paying boating gas. I'm not able to write off the costs associated with that travel, at $2 a liter or $3 a liter at the marinas. I may have to pay lock fees or subscribe to an annual lock pass, to receive a bit of a discount. And none of this is covered. It's all expenses that I pay out of my own pocket. So I wonder whether we could, in some way, shape, or form, enable or empower our treasurer, and or VP of Finance at her discretion to approve expenses that are based on a valid business requirement. So if I were to submit an expense and say, hey, this was my lock fee for this weekend, and here's who I was visiting, and here's an email confirming that I went to go see them, and by way of Google Maps, I calculated it's 5 kilometers from the nearest marina to that person's, cottage and back, and here's what our boating rate is going to be. Please approve it. Do we need to have that in a policy? Does it need to be codified, or can it not just be at the discretion of our treasurer or our finance team, and maybe perhaps an approval from the mayor, to go ahead and approve it? So let's maintain the honorarium, because that's a taxable benefit. And of course, if we increase that, we're just going to pay more tax. I would echo Brian Bocek or Councillor Bocek in let's consider the additional cost in our benefits, because to his point, yeah, I mean, anything that you do nowadays with dental or anything along those lines is 5x what it was 2 years ago. And at the same time, let's look at nuanced expenses and leave it at the discretion of our staff to be able to say it's a legitimate business expense, and so therefore we're going to cover you. As a final point that I'd like to note, anyone who's watching this at home, our mayor has opened up Pandora's box by inviting you to comment. So please send your emails to mayor@gbtownship.ca, because I know that this is going to open up our inbox and explode. So with that said, I'm going to conclude and hopefully bring some humor to everyone's day. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hazelton.
Yes, thank you. I've got a few points. I guess the first one here is, I think we being few councillors must be speaking to different people and different types of people than you, Mayor, because everyone that I've spoken to about being a possible candidate have expressed the similar concern with, you want me to do what? For what? It's I mean, on one hand, it's disappointing, but I think we want to be aware that there's a very serious trend in Ontario, in everywhere, and the lack of volunteerism. And with the lack of volunteerism, you take people like the ones we have on council today who are essentially volunteering to do this job with a small stipend, which, as you've already heard, can't possibly cover the costs that we incur. And with the lack of volunteerism, finding anybody to do this job in the future is going to be a challenge. Okay, enough of that one. I really think that Councillor Cooper nailed the optics here. If we try to make things simple and throw it into an honorarium, and I just did a very simple math on calculations of one vehicle coming from Newmarket to the township office on the average, our clerk has told us, four meetings a month. That's $7,000 a year if we were to go with the CRA rates. That would be a 23% increase in our honorarium, and I think that nobody wants those optics. And I think that what I was hearing from Councillor Graziano, that looking at it more from an expense-based strategy makes a lot of sense. I would say that every business in Ontario, maybe every business in North America, have salespeople who expense travel. It's a standard thing. Everybody does it. It's got to be a cakewalk. I understand that we're implementing a town suite HR module. I can't believe that tracking expenses is going to be a complex thing, or could be a complex thing from a technology standpoint or a compensation standpoint. And I think that we need to understand how we can simplify the expenses for travel so that we don't make it difficult for councillors, and we don't make it difficult for staff and finance. And I'm not necessarily off the top of my head sure of exactly how we do that, but I was delinquent when I would fill out expense reports as a sales guy, and I would be 6-12 months in arrears, and then they would say, well, we're not paying you until you if you expense anything after 3 months. And so I got smart and filled it out. But you need, if we have some parameters around it, we can make it simple, and we can contain the complexity and reflect something that's a little bit more fair, with the end objective of not requiring councillors to be spending money out of their pockets to do this job. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Predko.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor. So my thoughts on this, I mean, I'm also of the mind that we want to keep our remuneration, whether it's expense or honorarium or health, fairly simple. And I would kind of view this maybe as a lump sum amount that was in a travel line item for councillors. But my concern with having expenses and an expense policy for travel in and around to do our business is that it lacks the transparency that I think our constituents and residents would maybe want to see. So if we don't have a cap or a visibility on how much people are expensing on these things, how will people know what our compensation is until there was a FOI request or something to bring out that information? So that's kind of where my concern is with going through expenses. I know I do think we need to consider how do we attract more interest in being a councillor, and maybe one of the things that we need to consider through our procedural bylaws is not meeting just once a month for council, but maybe having 2 council meetings and trying to shorten them and having them in the afternoon or in the evening, early evening, so that people can have a day job and participate either Zoom or in person. Because I don't think we're going to get there with a compensation package that's going to make any difference to anybody that is considering this. And then I guess the last question I have would be back to the clerk and the CAO is the feedback we're giving you helpful for deciding on option 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or is this just helping define where the direction of the report should go?
I'll go to our clerk and then to the CAO.
Thank you.
I get the picture. I think it's an elusive option 6 in some regards. I think it's to review the meeting allowance and have some consideration if that needs to be rolled into the honorarium or not, provide options for mileage or not, boat versus road versus in the township, outside the township. Benefits have come up several times as well. Staff time for consideration, ability to attract is a key thing that seems to be keeps popping up. So I think I have enough information to move forward. I mean, I still need a resolution passed, but it's kind of where I'm at.
CO Mariotti.
Thank you, Mayor Coutier. I think it's the first time I'm talking today, so that's pretty good. I wanted to share with you an angle that actually shocked me. I was at the Roma conference, and I forget if Mayor Coutier was there with me at the time during this one presentation, and it was regarding the mental stress that councillors and council go through. And this was a survey done amongst elected officials, and in the survey it said that the stress levels that elected officials were going through and the mental health challenges that they were going through is at the same level as those of a first responder. And that means a lot. Going back to some of the fundamental reasons why it's hard to attract people to run for council. There's a lot of stress out there. Certainly post-COVID, post some of the other social political issues that have come to light. That we have these keyboard warriors, and unfortunately that we have members within council that other members of council are feeling bullied, are feeling attacked. You just look at the city of Pickering as an example. More and more of these things are happening, which is turning away the will, if you like, for doing. It is in essence volunteerism, and I don't envy any member of council for doing what you do, because I know you're being pulled in millions of different directions. So I would just be cognizant as to why some people may not be as forthcoming and say, yeah, I want to run for council next term. It's because of the current environment that some councillors feel very uncomfortable having to deal with. The other aspect that has been touched on by council as well is the start time. And I'm being selfish by saying that staff love starting at 9 a.m. because it's it's part of our day. But if council wants to attract a different demographic that makes it easier for someone to have a full-time job as well as donate their time for public service, then council should look at a start time later on in the afternoon or maybe early evening. We're lucky that we have electronic means of hosting meetings. So if someone can't travel up here all the time or is cash strapped, then we can have someone can still do their duties remotely. But I just wanted to give you those couple of angles as to the state of political affairs.
Councillor Hazelton, you want to add a remark?
Can I just scream like I've been in a psyched out mental state mode? No, what I wanted to do is just highlight that in the report that we have seen here, COW 2024 002, which I'm guessing was January of 24. We came forward with a recommendation, and we are just beginning to revisit the topic now. I would hope that we're not looking at 2026 before we get to a new model, and I think that we've heard enough of, I think, general consensus of need for change. We need to look at this as definitely not a 1-year window, probably not a 6-month window, probably more like a 2 or 3 month window of suggestions that we can act on and put into play. Because having this gap of time between when we pass a resolution and then actually dive back into it, I think is counterproductive. So we should be putting a target date on next steps.
Councilor Cooper?
Just very briefly, I would like to remind council that the district of Muskoka used to have their council meetings in the evening, and they got changed. And reason being was driving, especially for somebody from the city, driving south at 11 or 12 o'clock at night in a snowstorm ain't a lot of fun. In fact, highly dangerous. So I suggest that. I also suggest that if you come by water, how would you like to be driving out in the dark? I used to love doing that when I was 18 and 20 and 25, but
Millennia ago.
a little bit older than that now, 19. But essentially, it's pretty tough navigating in the dark without the moon, for example. So I just remind us of that. And actually, the district former chair moved the meetings up to 3 o'clock. They still were closing off after dark. So the current chair moved it to 1 o'clock, and it's worked out rather well. So I just would remind us of that it's the only challenge now is making committee meetings at 9 o'clock in Bracebridge is sometimes not the easiest thing. So we need to think about start times and so on, because many of us are a long way away. So thank you.
Lots of input. I have a few comments. One was, I've heard, I think from Councilors Bocek and Graziano about the cost of running their boats to see constituents and going through locks and dock fees and all that sort of thing. I have found in my experience that if I'm going to see somebody with a water access place, or they want me to see something that's water accessible, they've always offered to pick me up. I've never trailered a boat to see a constituent or a situation. Usually the resident who is concerned, we agree to a meeting spot, and they take me by boat. The other thing I heard is optics, and the suggestion that giving people expense money is better optically than giving them a raise. I don't think our residents are that stupid. If we make the decision that we are going to give a counselor $7,000 to go back and forth from their home in a year, I mean, I'm just made up the number, but I believe somebody made reference to $7,000. But if we're going to give somebody $7,000, whether we call it expense or we call it an honorarium, they're still getting that $7,000.
It's taxed if it's an honorarium. It's not taxed if it's an expense.
If
You would have to gross it up to 12 probably if it's not an expense.
But it's still going to cost our residents that much more to have somebody sitting at this bench than now. Councilor Redco?
Just to clarify my comment on transparency was about not having the amount visible up front as part of our package, but having it expensed through the year, and residents wouldn't be able to see how much money was being expensed for travel if we did it that way.
Except that most municipalities, I don't know if it's a requirement, but most municipalities, most organizations, they give you an annual report at the end of the year, and that includes not only the the honorarium paid to counselors, but also the expenses that they incurred, whether it was commuting back and forth or going to some conference or what have you. So the information would come out.
District does that.
Yes, well, and I think most municipalities do.
Right.
I mean, and so does the province and the feds, because it's always worthy of press when they say so-and-so has spent this much on expenses versus somebody else. So I think, I think the optics, to me, the optics of this are, we are discussing whether or not we are being paid enough, or let me rephrase that, whether our replacements next term, whether they include any of us or it's 100% replace, our counselors next term, are we going to have trouble filling the bench here unless we pay 10%, 25%, 50% more than we are now, regardless of what we call it? And so I think that, you know, we can go through all this, but I think we have to be honest with ourselves and honest with our residents that if we start paying expenses, commuting expenses, or more expenses for attendance at events or what have you, that's going to cost our residents. And so, you know, again, I just think we have to be honest that when we're talking about giving ourselves more money, one form or another, it's going to cost our residents, and they have to be aware of that. Councillor Bochek, you want to start round 3?
Through you, Mayor. I think our constituents understand the pressures that their councillors are under. I'll give you an example. Councillor Hazelton was elected to sit on the Muskoka Watershed Council Board. The meetings are sometimes in Huntsville, they're sometimes over in Lake of Bays, and for him to travel that far, same with Councillor Graziano with SSEA. There's other costs that our constituents don't see that Councillor Jarvis, his library board meetings or SEGBAY, our appointment to SEGBAY. In order to attend these, they have to drive up from the city to do it. So there's a lot of hidden costs that our constituents don't see. But I'll tell you who does see it is the person who wants to run in the next election. They judge, you know, I'm going to lose this amount of money by not going to work that day to come up here to be a counselor. And if you make $400 or $500 a day, which is not uncommon, you deduct that and come up here and work for $30. That's very, very evident to the people that are looking at serving their community. So there's two real things there. There's hidden expenses that they are not explained or shown to our constituents. And two, the attractive amount is going to have to be substantially higher than what we're getting now. And I don't care if it's in the way of a snippet, an expense, or an increase in honorarium. I'm very happy to go out to my constituents and say, I make this amount of money, $30,000 a year for being a counselor. And if they question it, I can certainly explain it to them what the additional costs that they don't see are. And so that's my 2 cents.
I'm just going to add to that with a personal experience. One of the things that I will admit I did not count for when I first elected is, and this is of course pre-COVID, I averaged before being elected to office 20,000 kilometers a year on my car. You know, some years up, some years down. First year after elected, I was 40,000. And by the way, that didn't, you know, my 20,000 included my commute back and forth to the office and business driving that I did prior to this job. So I would argue I drove 25,000 kilometers that year on work related.
And you know, they say, hey, and I say, yeah, I get paid for they receive. They can't believe what we would do if we do for that amount. So being fully transparent, saying to my constituents, I'm making $30,000 a year. They'll still laugh at us for what we're making, but I'm very proud to say to them, this is what I'm making. I have no fear of somebody saying at all.
Well, you should be paying more attention to social media then.
If I could just say.
Councillor Cooper.
A quick thing. I think many of our residents have
Microphone, please.
sorry about that. I do believe that it would be quite acceptable to have a travel expense that was more in keeping with the costs associated with this. And I think everybody would understand it because they know what it's like when they worked for a corporation or a municipality for that matter. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Kirk Way, are you okay? Any other comments? Well, what I'm hearing generally from council is you're keen on option 6, which is conduct a full review and provide options for travel allowance and or mileage, annual honorarium, and IT stipend. All right, Councillor Hazelton.
Friendly amendment on the recommendation. I don't want to be heard. Friendly amendment on the recommendation, assuming it's a resolution where we would, in addition to putting option 6, which I'm assuming that's where you're going, but tag on and that staff aim to return to council within 90 days for a report.
Modifications happening. Fake she who modifies.
You don't need a mover and seconder?
She's decided it's a friendly amendment based on the conversations. Okay.
You think I'd get
Councillors Vocek and Cooper, do you accept Councillor Hazelton's recommendation as a friendly amendment?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I have one question.
Yeah.
And this would be to our director of finance. Microphone.
If this was enacted in this year, it's not a budgeted item. So you know what that means. We all know what that means. So perhaps a date to initiate this would be better off when the budget is set for it, and that would also help with the attraction of new councillors. So your opinion on, if this gets ratified in the next 90 days, that it should be a budgeted amount and then it would start, say, January of next year.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor Coutier, to Councillor Vocek, I would absolutely recommend that. If it was enacted in this current year, you'd be looking at funding it through reserves, which is not something that I would recommend in terms of it being an operating budget. That is something that is going forward. So my recommendation would be, if it is incorporated, have it included in the 2026 budget.
Thank you.
Thank you.
What about your slush fund?
Oh. I have moved by Councillor Vocek, seconded by Councillor Cooper. Be it resolved that Committee of the Whole recommends staff to proceed with option 6 as outlined in Report 2025-016 for the Council Remuneration Review, and that the report be brought back within 90 days. All those in favor? And that is carried. And moved by Councillor Predko, seconded by Councillor Graziano. Be it resolved, the Committee of the Whole does now adjourn at 12:44 to reconvene on March 4th, 2025, or at the call of the chair. All those in favor? And that is carried. We are done. Thank you very much, everyone.